presentation. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Jer Bryant. I'm the director of the Writing Center. I'm also an interfaith chaplain here and teach in the English department. Welcome to our talk on revising research-based essays. Again, my name's Jer. My pronouns are he, him. I'll pass it over to Abby.
Hi there, I'm Abby Lowry. I am the instruction librarian at the Knight-Capron Library, and I'm excited to be with you guys tonight.
Julia?
Okay. Hi, I'm Julia, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the supervising tutors at the Wilmer Writing Center.
And Rachel.
Hello, I'm Rachel. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a biology and chemistry major here, and I've been working at the Writing Center for about 1.5 years now.
Great. Well, the way we envision this talk to go is Wilmer Writing Center will talk about some tips for revising and editing an essay, and then we're going to turn it over to Abby, and she's going to talk about finding more resources, because so often when we look back at our papers or we receive feedback on drafts, we need more evidence or more support. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can begin presenting. And Julia, if you'll just let me know once I start sharing, if you can see it, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, first I want to talk about the difference between revising and editing. What do we mean? Because those are two different processes. Revising is dealing with higher order concerns, whereas editing is dealing with what we call lower order concerns. So what exactly do we mean by higher order concerns? Higher order concerns, according to UNA's Center for Writing Excellence, are concerns that deal with audience, purpose, thesis statements, organization, development, which includes support and evidence, and your introduction paragraph and your concluding paragraph. Whereas lower order concerns, according to Purdue's Online Writing Lab, deal with sentence structure, punctuation, word choice, and spelling. They're called lower order concerns because a writer might cut sentences during the revision stage, so they should not focus on editing first. Some sentences, paragraphs, or even pages could get cut, so we don't spend a lot of time tweaking or editing grammar at first. Let's talk a little bit about revising. I like the expression that time heals. And what we mean by this is that you want to wait to come back to a document after you're done drafting it. It's nice to return to a piece that you've written a day or two later and look at it freshly and see what might need to be altered. I think it's really interesting. Stephen King gives like the suggestion of waiting weeks to return to a document, maybe a short story. But here we don't have that kind of time usually when we're a student. So I would suggest giving yourself at least a day, maybe two, to return back to your work and look at it. We often feel like, well, we wrote it, so we don't want to change it. But like David Morley says, rewriting is writing. You need to be prepared to cut sentences, paragraphs, or even pages if they don't serve the purpose of your document. So don't become so attached to something that you don't feel as though you can alter it. And I highly suggest thinking about what we call the reader-centered approach, becoming one with the reader. Look at your work as an audience member and anticipate what questions the audience might have, and where are some parts that they might stumble. Are there parts where they're going to need more clarification, explanation, or even research?
Okay, so a little bit more about this reader-centered approach Jer was talking about. This is concerned with audience, which is one of our higher order concerns that are pretty important for our paper. And these are just a couple of questions you can ask yourself if you find yourself struggling with this. And basically, a reader-centered approach we just really want to familiarize ourselves with who our audience might be, what existing knowledge they have, and what do they need to know, and that'll go a little bit into the purpose as well. What objections they might have, and what sources might they value. So it really depends on your audience what type of evidence you're going to be including in your paper. Some might value non-scholarly sources such as websites, but others might value scholarly sources like research, peer-reviewed articles, and everything like that. So it's really important to determine who your audience is, what they know, and what they need to know in order to find out what evidence you should include. Next slide. Okay, and this is a little bit more about purpose, which is another higher order concern. And our different paper assignments, they might have a different end goal in mind. They can entertain, inform, persuade, or even a combination of the two. So that might look like argumentative papers that can both inform and persuade an audience, or maybe something like creative writing, which can inform and entertain at the same time. So when you're reading over your paper and revising, you want to ask yourself if your document is accomplishing this purpose. And you can do this in tandem with your assignment directions and see if a prompt or any details help you determine what type of paper this should be, and then see if, depending on what it is it informing, is it entertaining, persuading, or a combination?
So when we're looking back, we kind of look first at our higher order concerns. So we consider the thesis, the organization, development, introduction, and conclusion. So, as Jer said, we start with the bigger things. So we start with the thesis, which really builds our entire essay. And we organize, which really sets up our paper in that logical order, so that as you're building your argument, your reader will be like, yes, I follow that. And you go to your next point, yes, I follow that. And so you develop that. And your introduction, your conclusion will just bookend that so that you have the most effective paper. Next slide, please. And so when we review our thesis, there's kind of some tips. According to North Carolina Chapel Hill, the thesis will tell the reader how you will interpret the significance of the subject matter under discussion. It's the roadmap for the paper, and it makes a claim that others might dispute. So if your thesis is that puppies are cute, and there is a group of people who might argue puppies are not cute, like, fight me on this, or it's setting up puppies are cute, and your body paragraphs are puppies are cute because they lick you, and puppies are cute because they're small, and puppies are cute because they're fluffy, and those are your 3 supporting paragraphs. So it sets up your entire paper. So that's why it's so important to have a strong, clear thesis. And these are some things you need to ask yourself if it performs these functions. This is one sample thesis that would be good. While there are many benefits to technology, there are also several unexpected consequences that can harm one's overall physical and emotional well-being. So this kind of looks at the first part, which is, sure, there are benefits to technology, and then it lets you know that the paper is also going to say, well, there could be some drawbacks to technology. So that's kind of the view that you're going to get, a little sort of skeleton of the paper that you're seeing right here in the thesis. Next slide, please.
So the next matter of higher order concern is the organization. The organization of your paper might be determined by what you're writing, like the genre. It could also, however, be determined by what the audience expects, or even what your professor expects. So when you're reviewing your paper after you've drafted it, you need to ask these questions. Does your work follow the template? So if your work is a lab report, there might be a specific format it has to follow. Or if your professor gave you steps to follow, you would need to make sure that you have done so in the order that the professor desires. Does the work move in a logical order? So what we mean by this is, if it's an argumentative essay, have you organized your points from the least profound, important, shocking points to the most profound, important, or shocking points? It's human nature for us to move in this way. Even when we tell a story, we do this. Are there interruptions or moments where fluidity is lost? And what we mean by this is, are there moments in your paper in which you sort of go off on a tangent? Maybe you're not moving in a linear fashion like we do when we write. You've stepped aside and you've interrupted the flow of the paper with a discussion that doesn't fit where it is. And then lastly, you want to ask yourself if your work is organized recursively. And what we mean by this is, does each sentence and each paragraph build upon the previous sentence? Or does each paragraph build upon the previous paragraph? Again, this is the way that we tend to write in a linear fashion. So there are ways to check the organization of your paper. Purdue's online writing lab suggests outlining, but we would really call this reverse outlining. One way to do this is to, on a separate sheet of paper or separate window or document, go through and number each paragraph and type what each paragraph is about. You can then look at the numbers and the list and sort of figure out if you've moved in a logical manner. But you can also look to see, like, have you discussed a point in paragraph 4 and then again in paragraph 8? And maybe you need to move that discussion from paragraph 8 to paragraph 4, for example. Or do you have a paragraph that's totally off topic that you need to remove? So reverse outline is very helpful for organization. You can also use what's called the does says method, which essentially in the marginalia, you comment about what each paragraph does or says. And then again, you look back at the notes and figure out if the organization is logical, if there's anything that sticks out as non-essential or not important or off topic, and if there are any parts of the paper that need to be moved to be with other parts. And so this helps if you're a person who sometimes repeats information or points. This will help you avoid that repetition.
So, looking at development, there's some questions you can ask yourself. So, under support, you could ask, are there adequate details and examples? Is there sufficient evidence or research? Do you need more research or evidence or support? And how about engagement? Are you engaging the reader, or are you just boring them with a list of facts? There, even in an analytical paper, there are ways to keep your readers engaged. And you also look at your discussion, your commentary, your interpretation, analysis, things like that. So you look at these support points, and you have to support your thesis, the thesis that I talked about before. And so you also ask yourself, is the writer's voice present? Is it balanced? And are all claims supported? So theoretically, in the thesis statement about puppies are cute, if you make it all about how puppies are fluffy and you don't focus at all about the fact that puppies are small and they lick you, then there's not really balance in those three thesis points. You really got to give a fair amount of attention to all of those points because they're all mentioned in your thesis. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about balance, is that your thesis has to um, give kind of what's due to all the parts. And that's where you support all claims. So if you say aren't supporting, part B of your thesis, that's where it's unbalanced and your reader has felt like, wait, you mentioned this, where is it? So things like that, it's the roadmap and you want to come back to it.
Great. And I think I would add here too that a lot of times professors will see students who have a thesis that covers multiple points, and students really bring the support and maybe two of the, two of the points, but then that last point really does not have significant research or evidence. The reader's always going to remember the weak spot. And so that's exactly what Julia is saying about making sure you have adequate research or support for each point in your paper, and that you don't go overboard on one point and neglect another point.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, moving right along into our introduction, which we can also refer to as our opening paragraph. It's another one of our higher order concerns, so definitely a good thing to pay a lot of attention to. And when you're revising your introduction, you can check to make sure that it is engaging, it is concise, it is clear, and whether or not it contains a thesis. And Julia touched on this a little bit. We do want our papers to be engaging. We want to pull the reader in. We want to make them read our paper. And there are a couple different ways you can do that. You could always include a question right at the beginning, something to get them thinking, or maybe a strong statement that makes them interested in what you have to say. And whether it is concise or not means it refers to how many words you put it in. Basically, we want to get our argument across in as little words as possible while still having that meaning come across really strong, and whether it is clear or not. Will your audience understand what exactly you are trying to say? Although it may make sense to you as a writer, sometimes it can be difficult to get that message across to the reader. So again, looking back at that reader-centered approach, you can say, if I were reading this paper and I didn't have any of this knowledge, would I know what I'm talking about? And then your thesis, which is so important, roadmap to the paper. And something to note is that all of these things are sort of going to be dependent on what type of paper it is. For a short paper, it will most likely have a shorter introduction. And it's important to note that research won't necessarily be in the introduction paragraph, but that'll happen further along in subsequent paragraphs. So the introduction, we can include broad information at the top and then narrow it down into our thesis and have our specific argument included there. Next slide. Okay, yeah, so the introduction's opposite, the conclusion. I thought of an interesting analogy. I sort of like to think of the introduction paragraph as like the past, and the conclusion is kind of like the future. So the introduction, you want to provide any like broad, not necessarily specific information, but just a sort of zoomed out look of your topic and anything that might influence your argument, whereas your conclusion is really going to focus on implications and future possibilities for what your paper discusses. But some questions you can ask to see whether your conclusion is looking good while you're revising is that, does it echo the thesis? So they're going to have similar ideas, but it is important that you don't use the exact same language. You are still going to have to vary it up a little bit. And does it correlate with the introduction? Do they have similar ideas? Are you introducing anything new? That can throw the reader off a little bit. So you basically just, you sort of want to say the same thing, but with different language, and then you can consider your implications as well. And does it provide a recap? So your opening paragraph will provide an introduction, and your conclusion provides a conclusion. So make sure that you're again telling your reader what you discussed. And for implications, you could be calling the audience to action. You could be making a prediction. Again, it depends on the paper, but you are going to have that last piece in your conclusion that sort of considers the future implications.
Another important step to take is checking the prompt. So when you're done drafting and you're going back and you're revising your work, I always suggest that the prompt is beside the writer during the whole process because it's very easy to forget, especially if the prompt is long. Does the document actually accomplish the expectations, all of the expectations expressed in the prompt or the directions? You might need to break down the writing prompt or color code parts of it, or even turn it into a checklist. That's not a bad idea to do if there are many steps that you need to make sure you cover.
So, one more thing to add to that is that I will annotate my prompt if it's one of those big blocky things, just like Jara was saying about like highlighting and stuff. But moving on to lower order concerns, we don't say that because they're unimportant. We say that because they're just a little lower on the priority, because if your essay doesn't make sense, it doesn't matter if you have perfect grammar if you're not making sense. So the best, most important advice we can give you is to read the work aloud. Distance yourself from it for a moment and then come back to it and read it to yourself. And you will hear the little stutters in grammar. You will hear how it sounds to the reader. That's the reader centered approach. You will feel almost like a stranger reading it. You'll feel, that bit of distance of coming back to a new work. And, well, if I wasn't in the moment of, I know what I was going to say, I know what I was trying to say, no, this is what you really said, and you'll hear it. And so it's really, really helpful to read it to yourself, or even have a tutor or a friend review it. So that's where we come in at the Writing Center. It's great because we can read it to you, and you can really auditorially process those aspects of, oh, well, wait, there's a natural pause here. That might be a place for a comma or something like that. And this also helps you look for common errors like fragments, commas, tense shifts, or even just vagueness, like they did this thing that happened to them there. None of that is specific enough to make much sense. So things like that, you will really be able to weed that out so quickly by reading it aloud to yourself. Next slide.
So keep in mind that parenthetical or in-text citations and works cited or reference entries are extremely important. Accidental plagiarism is still plagiarism, and you never want to be accused of plagiarism. So you need to ask yourself if your paper has adequate parenthetical citations or endnotes or footnotes, superscripts, whatever you've been asked to use. And you definitely need to ask yourself these questions. Do all of the sources used in the paper appear in the work cited? And are all sources in the work cited used in the body of the paper? The first thing that I do when I grade papers is detach the work cited or the reference page and have it with me as I'm reading a paper. So sometimes students put things in their works cited that they decide to not use in their paper. That can cause a problem. Sometimes students use sources within the body of the paper and just forget to put it in the works cited. That's also a problem. So make sure that you look at both your parenthetical citations and your works cited entries and make sure that they correlate. I can't stress that enough. So we're going to turn this over now to Abby. Thank you so much, Julia and Rachel.
Great. All right. Thanks, guys. Let me go ahead and start presenting my screen. I have some slides. All right, Jer, am I presenting?
You are.
Okay, great. Okay, so I am looking at revision strategies from the perspective of a librarian, obviously. So we're going to talk a lot about the evidence or sources that you found in your paper. The first strategy we're going to talk about is potentially finding additional sources. Maybe you've gotten some feedback from your professor or the person who's peer reviewing for you that you're missing some evidence to hold up some of the things you're trying to say in your paper, or maybe you just don't have enough sources for basically the things that your professor told you had. Like maybe the professor said you had to have 3 to 5 sources and you're falling short there. The second thing is checking your sources, and that's going to reiterate what Jared was just talking about avoiding plagiarism. And then the last thing I want to talk about is kind of how to make the revision process easier next time around, and that's being a responsible researcher. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so like I mentioned, additional research needed. This is when you are finished writing and you realized I'm coming up short. I don't have enough evidence to support my argument or claims. How am I going to add more? I feel like I have exhausted my search strategies. I don't know where to find more sources. And one of the things we can do, I mean, you could go back and start from scratch, right? You could go right back into an article database or into Google or wherever you've been searching and try to find things again. Or a lot of times students already have a lot of good sources right in front of them and they're not making use of them. So if you have a couple good sources in your paper already, you can use those to find additional sources. All right, so librarians like to call that citation chaining. And I know this image looks a little bit intimidating, but essentially what you're doing with citation chaining is finding other sources that an article that you're already using has referenced, or you're discovering sources that reference your particular article. And we can do this both forwards and backwards. And I'll show you what that looks like. So starting with backward chaining, what you're going to do is look at the reference list of the article that you already have. And I should mention, I'm glad Rachel talked about in your paper, one of your motivations for the type of sources that you want is dependent on what kind of sources that your audience is going to value. And the examples that I have here are scholarly sources. But this could be applied to popular sources as well. But for this one, it's scholarly sources, it's scholarly articles. Sorry about that. Okay, but so backward chaining, again, you're going to take an article, and this one I have as an example here. This is one that I have decided I'm already using in my paper. I really like it. And what I'm going to do is actually make use of this author's reference list, or these authors' reference list. So in this case, I'm going to come over here. You can see that this particular article is well organized, and I've got my references listed here. And I can scroll through and see if any of these sources might be useful for my paper. It's also nice in this particular database, they're linking you out to these articles. So you can see where it's trying to get you to search it through Google Scholar. This one has the actual link, really well organized. They're not always this clean and nice, but you get the idea. So, and a lot of times with these scholarly articles, they're going to have quite a few references in their list. So usually you can find something that you might be able to tack on to your reference list as well. Because again, if you have a source already that's relevant for you, most likely the sources they use to write their paper are also going to be in some way relevant. All right, so that's backward chaining. What about forward chaining? So forward chaining is when you look to see who has cited the particular article that you already have in your hands. So this one is good, again, if you're looking to beef up your list of sources, but it's also a useful one if you're finding that the sources you're finding are too old. So maybe you have a source from 2012 and your professor is telling you that you have to have sources from within the last 5 years. Forward chaining is a way to find sources that have been written more recently. So in this case, I bring up, and I've got another Elsevier article here. And you could do a similar thing. I mean, you can backwards and forward chain with any article. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste the title of this article into Google Scholar. If you're not familiar with Google Scholar, it's a pretty robust search tool, so it's definitely worthwhile to get familiar with it. So I copy and pasted the article title into Google Scholar, and I found here that this article has been cited by 39 other people. And if I click on this, it's actually going to take me to those other articles. Sometimes you can run into things like trying to find the actual full text of the article can be tricky. But with a lot of these, it looks like they're available. PDF is right here. And so again, that's a way of bringing the information forward. So that article that I had before, it was from 2012. Now I'm seeing things from 2013. I've even got a Google book from 2018, all of that. And I plugged it into Google Scholar because it has this cited by tool. A lot of the article databases that the library subscribes to are starting to add things like this, but it's already there in Google Scholar, so it's worth checking there first. Okay, so that's forward chaining. And again, you can go backwards and forwards with any of the articles that you have. And I should mention too that you can use this for things like more popular sources. A lot of times news articles will have some references listed, or they might at least be linking out to studies or where they got their information from, or at least maybe mentioning someone's name that they've interviewed. And then you could look up that person and find out if they've been published somewhere else or what else they have to say on the subject. Lots of ways, again, to make use of the sources you already have rather than being discouraged and feel like you have to start over from ground zero. Okay, so just to reiterate again, as a librarian, of course, I'm going to talk about avoiding plagiarism, super important. And essentially, yes, you're just making sure that any of the sources you cited in your paper are in your reference list, and then vice versa, as Jared mentioned. And then you're also going to need to double check the formatting of your citations. Nobody likes writing citations, right? They're tricky. Just remembering commas and periods sometimes is super frustrating. So there is a tool called RefWorks that the library subscribes to, and this could be a whole nother session on how to use RefWorks. But I will point you to the fact that the library has a quick tutorial on how to use it. Essentially, it is a citation management software. You can upload all of your sources into it, and it will spit out citations for you. It even cooperates with Google Docs, so you can have it open while you're writing your papers, and it will put in parenthetical citations, footnotes, all of those fun things for you. I also wanted to point you to the library and the Writing Center came together and created an APA style guide, and then we have one for MLA as well. And I'll share these slides with you, and these slides will also be published on the library website, so you can come back to these things later. But even just the knowledge that they exist, hopefully you can go back and search for them later or ask a librarian and we can point you to them. All right, so the last thing I wanted to say, and again, this is kind of for next time, if you're already in the revising process, or maybe you're not, maybe you're getting ready to plan out a paper. These are good things to know ahead of time. Taking notes throughout your search process is so important. A lot of times students come to us when they're revising or editing a paper and they can't track down this one source that they had, or again, they're trying to find new sources and they can't remember what those search terms were that help them find the best articles. So keeping track of search terms, just creating a Google Doc of those things or the search strategies you used or even where you were searching can be really helpful. And then again, keeping track of the articles and sources you find so you're not trying to hunt and gather for those when you're editing and revising right at the end. A tool like RefWorks can help with that for sure. So the last thing I want to mention is if you're stuck in the revising process or in finding sources, or you still don't quite understand what I mean by citation chaining, the library is here to help you. And if you weren't aware, there is a library chat feature on our website. And you can see this GIF is kind of trying to demonstrate it for you, but I'll show you live right now as well. So on the library's website, this chat button here, you can click on, and it is active while we are open. You can chat with a librarian or a library staff member this way. I'm really tempted to chat with Angela right now and ask her for sources on why puppies are cute and see what she comes up with. We should have collaborated, Julia. I should have found sources on that. That would have been great. But this chat service is a really quick and easy way to get help when you're stuck finding things. And then the other thing I will point out is under the Get Help tab, research appointments. You can also schedule a time to sit down with a librarian and we can walk through some of these strategies with you. Or even if you're starting from the beginning, we can walk through how to find some sources that are useful. But yeah, that's essentially all I had to cover tonight. And I will toss it back. Let me stop presenting. And yeah.
Thank you, Abby. We appreciate it. That was wonderful. Before we start talking about any questions that we might have, I just want to share this link with you in case you need us to email your professor that you came to get extra credit or something like that. And there's also just a question or two about how how well you think we did, any comments that you might have. We would very much appreciate it. And then I'm also going to embed this link to how to make an appointment in Wilmer Writing Center, just because we are functioning online this semester, but we're still offering both live or synchronous appointments and e-tutoring appointments, which are asynchronous, in which you upload your paper and receive feedback through email. So it doesn't get much better than that if you have a busy schedule. Are there any questions that you might have that we could help with, either, about writing, revising, or anything that Abby covered?
I promise there are no stupid questions. I have
All,
them all the time.
all questions are good questions and are welcome. Okay. Well, I think, well, I do believe that a lot of students in the writing workshop are revising their third essay, turning it into their fourth, and they have to find more research. So I hope that this presentation helps, especially once we get it emailed out. But we're always here to help, and Wilmer and Knight-Capron are a great team. We work together, and we very much enjoy working together. And I'll say that our next project will be an erasure project. It's a creative writing project that's coming in April. So stay tuned for information on that. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either Abby or to me or Julia or Rachel, and we'll be glad to help you. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much.
Bye.